So we're going to start talking about how the cell actually makes energy. So up to this point, we've talked about the idea of photosynthesis, which is how plants create their sugar, right? Because they can't go get it. Animals don't have to do that because we can go get our sugar. So we get our sugar. So once we have our sugar, oh, now what? How do we make actual energy out of it? And in the first lecture in this unit, I talked about this molecule called ATP, or adenosine triphosphate. So the entire process of making our energy really is all about taking a molecule called adenosine diphosphate, which has two phosphates on it, and then adding a third. So essentially, it's a process in which I'm going to use the term charge and recharge and dead batteries, right? So we have these batteries, which are going to be the ADP, right, which is going to be the uncharged battery, and then we're going to charge it by adding a phosphate. So cell respiration is really all about charging these batteries and making them usable so we can then have energy to use. So the first thing we're going to talk about here is an equation which should look kind of familiar to you. This should look very similar to something we just learned, which is photosynthesis. If you remember photosynthesis, you take carbon dioxide and water and then energy from the sun. You go through this process which involves the light reactions in the Calvin cycle. And what you get is you get sugar and you get oxygen as a byproduct. Well, in cell respiration, it's almost the same process, it's just reversed. So if you take a look here, you can see what goes in for cell respiration is oxygen, 6 oxygen molecules, 1 molecule of glucose, C6H12O6. That goes in, and then what comes out is you get carbon dioxide, you get 6 water, and then you get this thing called ATP, which is this usable energy. So if you haven't noticed it yet, photosynthesis and cell respiration are opposite processes. They actually work together to allow life to exist. Without those processes, we'd be in big trouble because oxygen comes from photosynthesis. It's produced from the plants. So let's keep going. The actual process of cell respiration actually has multiple angles. You can take multiple routes. And the first one we're going to talk about is when there's not oxygen available. But I'm going to just switch to the next slide real quick and just show you. This is a diagram of the process. So as you can see, when you think of cellular respiration, we're talking about 3 distinct processes of one overall process. And the first step is something called glycolysis, which is right here. And in this step, it happens outside of the mitochondria. So this whole process, when you think about energy, you probably think about the mitochondria, or you should think about the mitochondria. It's the powerhouse of the cell, right? That is the part of the cell that makes energy. If you think about your analogies, most of you chose like the generator or the electrical supply. For whatever your analogy was of the cell, the mitochondria was the thing that makes the energy. And that's true in the actual cell. So the mitochondria is represented right here. And the mitochondria really has 2 components to it, which we're going to talk about in this unit. But in the mitochondria are the second and the third step of the process. So the first step is outside of the mitochondria, that's glycolysis. And then the second step is called the Krebs cycle. And the third step is called the electron transport chain. And these steps are going to happen inside the mitochondria. But let's talk about glycolysis first. And that's what we're going to talk about for the rest of this lecture. So the first stage is called glycolysis, and glycolysis tells you exactly what it is. Glyco, like if you remember glycogen, glyco just means sweet and it means sugar. So glyco refers to sugar. And lysis we've seen before. We've talked about hydrolysis, we've talked about lysosomes. So hopefully remember that lysis means to cut. To lyse means to cut. So what are we talking about here? Well, glyco means sugar and lysis means to cut. So what is glycolysis? It's cutting sugar. And that's exactly what's happening here. Glucose is a 6-carbon molecule, C6H12O6. So in order to start this process, the first thing we need to do is we need to take that glucose molecule and break it in half. First thing you do when you eat food, if I were to say, all right, go eat that sandwich right now, the first thing you're probably going to do is you're going to take a bite off of it. And then the second thing you're going to do is you're hopefully going to chew. Because if you don't chew and you just swallow that bite, you're going to choke and you're not going to die. You're going to die, right? And that's because you can't breathe when there's food, it gets trapped in your throat. So why does the sugar get broken down? Well, because this sugar then has to get used in the next step, which is inside the mitochondria. So in order for it to get into the mitochondria, it needs to be broken down into a smaller form, which is called pyruvic acid or pyruvate. So the first step here is called glycolysis, and in glycolysis, you get a molecule of glucose, which is made up of 6 carbons, and then you break that into 2 3-carbon molecules. So you're cutting it in half. And then that actually happens in the cytoplasm outside of the mitochondria. Now here's the thing that's kind of interesting. This whole process that we're talking about here, called cell respiration, is about making energy, about making ATP. But there is something that does need to happen first, and that is called the activation energy. If you remember back to enzymes, we talked about this idea of activation energy. It's the energy that has to go in to make something happen. So if I want to light a fire, if I want to have a fire burning, I need to first light a match and provide energy to it, and then the fire burns. Well, this process has an activation energy cost. It actually costs 2 ATP to get this party started. So the analogy of chewing is a good one. Does it take energy to chew your food? Yes, it does, right? Those muscles use energy. Is it worth using that energy to chew the food? Yes, it is, because when you chew it, it's now small enough to swallow, and you can digest it, and then from that, you can get all this new energy. So it would be like if I said, hey, if you give me $2 today, I'm going to bring you back 4 tomorrow. You made $2 out of that, right? It cost you 2, you had to give me 2, but I invested your $2 and it made 4. So when I come back and give it to you, you get your $2 back plus another 2. So you get a total of $4, but you made 2. And that is what happens here. The activation energy is very simply the energy that goes in. So what ends up happening in this process is you get 4 ATP at the end. So it makes some ATP, but it also makes a molecule called NADH. And NADH is what we're going to consider a charged battery. They're electron carriers. That should sound familiar to you. In photosynthesis, there was NADPH. It's a very similar molecule. It's just a little bit different. So it's called NADH. And these molecules are then going to get used in the next 2 steps. And what you need to know about this step, first thing you really need to know is you do not need oxygen for this. So it does not require oxygen. So just a quick review. The first step of this process is called glycolysis. We get glucose, and where does the glucose come from? We eat it, right? Now plants make it, and they use it as well, but we eat our glucose, so we eat something, and it goes through this process called glycolysis, and we get our pyruvate. And then that pyruvate is going to go on to go into the next step to make the energy, but it does cost 2 ATP. It makes 4, so you get a little ATP out of it, you get something out of it, but it does cost a little bit to get it started, and it does not require oxygen. Thank you very much.